Good evening. My name is Stacy Brightman, and I'm the executive director of the Ebell of Los Angeles and the Wilshire Ebell Theater. And on behalf of the Ebell Board of Directors and our incredible membership that is a community of volunteers and supporters and leaders and our staff, I am honored to welcome you tonight to this exquisite historic theater in the heart of Los Angeles. A little history to tell you about where you are. The Ebell was founded in 1894 in the fervor of the women's movement and when Los Angeles County only had about 100,000 people in it. And it was founded by a small group of bold women who joined together to carve out a public civic role for themselves. They could not vote, and most avenues of education and career were tightly shut against them. They believed that by banding together and creating their own opportunities to create, to learn, to advocate, and to lead, they could create a better future for their daughters, their sisters, their mothers, oh, and yes, their husbands, sons, and brothers, too. Yeah. Our mission remains essentially the same as with our founding mothers, to inspire women and to build community. And as with our founders, art, culture, music, theater, literature, education, and service are the hammers of choice with which we build a better community and a better future. The Ebell women built this exquisite arts and education campus in 1927. So this whole beautiful theater is almost 100 years old. And in fact, our whole campus includes 5 different theaters. And it was meant to be a beautiful and inspiring beacon to all of Los Angeles and to be an inclusive space where art, ideas, and civic engagement converge. Indeed, this theater appears to be, and I've been researching this, the oldest theater in the country, built by women and still operated by women. It is a place where herstory has been made and celebrated for almost 100 years, from Judy Garland to Etta James to Hillary Clinton, from Nina Simone, Dolly Parton, Kamala Harris, and to tonight, to the extraordinary Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. We invite everyone here tonight to become part of the Ebell. The Ebell is a movement. We hope you'll consider becoming one of our members and part of our community. All are welcome. And as with any good theater, I know that the spirits of our founding mothers are here this evening, excited to learn and to be inspired by the program and by our honored speaker. But before we begin, the Ebell and I would like to thank and acknowledge some of the very special guests that we have with us this evening. We are honored to welcome LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell. And it's the place to be tonight, I'm telling you. Leaders from the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, leaders from the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, my sisters on the LA County Commission for Women, and the board of the Black Women Lawyers Association of Los Angeles. I have to admit, I'm probably most excited to welcome some student leaders who are here with us tonight and who are already working to create a more just and equitable future. We welcome the Ebell Scholars, students from the University of Southern California, and students from Mount St. Mary's University and the Center for the Advancement of Women. Your presence gives us joy. And before the conversation begins, let us reflect on this historic moment in this historic place. Here in Los Angeles, we have our first ever woman mayor. And our first ever all-women board of supervisors for LA County. Yeah. Let's recall what Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, quote, "People ask me sometimes when do you think it will be enough? When will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And my answer is, when there are 9. Our work is not finished, but today we are inspired and hopeful. Now, to help me welcome all of you and to share the plan for this evening, our wonderful Ebell member and partner, Andrea Grossman from Writer's Block. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. And I just want to add that we also have State Senator Smallwood Cuevas here tonight, and I'm thrilled. So, I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 29th season. Thank you. Massive thanks to my wonderful friends here at the Ebell for hosting us. And of course, I want to thank Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Angela Bassett for their graciousness in visiting with us tonight. So, while Stacy got to mention dignitaries and students, I get to do the fun stuff. I'm going to read you the rules of the road. You look like a lovely crowd, not inclined to make a scene, but all of you know that we're in strange times. So hear me out. Writer's Block and the Ebell believe in free speech. That said, the floor belongs only to Justice Jackson and Angela Bassett tonight. If we see any behavior that we think makes our guests or speakers feel unsafe or uncomfortable in any way, this is a polite warning. We retain the right to remove offenders. Thank you for abiding by our code of conduct. If you have any objections, tell it to the judge, or better yet, take your case to the Supreme Court. Okay. Now for tonight. What an opportunity for Los Angeles to see Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, a woman who so beautifully represents the best of what is possible in America. But you'll see that the justice's remarkable trajectory isn't unlikely or even unexpected. It's a goal she set for herself as a teenager. In her new book, Lovely One, the justice leads us through her personal and professional challenges, and her outspoken persona is emblematic of who she is on and off the bench. Her credo is, do the right thing and everything else will fall into place. Now that's an inspiring tenet for the Supreme Court. What we have tonight is a duet of superlatives on stage. Justice Jackson is indeed a supreme. And tonight we also have with us a queen. Actor, producer, director Angela Bassett is, of course, the unforgettable Queen Ramonda in Black Panther and Wakanda Forever. She played Tina Turner in What's Love Got to Do with It, in addition to so many other great roles. She's been nominated for countless prestigious awards, won an honorary Oscar, 2 Emmys, a SAG Award, Golden Globes, and 17 NAACP Image Awards. Angela Bassett's advocacy for social and humanitarian causes is always reflected in her work producing award-winning films and television series with her husband, Courtney Vance. So if you haven't purchased a book yet, you can pick up a copy from Reparations Club bookstore here in the lobby afterwards. They have a limited number of signed copies available, so grab them while they last. Here's what's going to happen tonight. Angela and the Justice will chat. We have gathered some questions from you by email, and we'll try to address some of those. Now, we know you want to take pictures, but that drives everyone crazy. We have a solution for that. When the Justice comes onto the stage in a moment, feel free to welcome her enthusiastically and noisily. She's going to read a few pages from her book. But when Angela Bassett joins her on stage, here's your chance for those photos. You can stand up, take pictures for about 20 seconds, and stay by your seat. No running in the aisles, no rushing the stage. There are so many cops here tonight, you have no idea. Then you sit down, make sure your phones are silenced, and you put them away and enjoy the program. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our great new United States Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Thank you very much. Hello, Los Angeles. You may be seated. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to be with you in Los Angeles. I thought that I would start by reading an excerpt from the preface of my book to get us warmed up. A sacred trust. I had to keep reminding myself this moment was real. It was just before noon on the 30th day of June, 2022, and I was standing in front of a plain wooden door that would soon open into the Grand West Conference Room of the Supreme Court of the United States. My family was already inside. My husband, Patrick, our daughters, Talia and Layla, and my parents, Johnny and Ellery Brown, were there among the family members and friends who had gathered to witness my historic swearing in. My heart was hammering so loudly that I wondered if the two black-robed men standing on either side of me, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. and retiring Associate Justice Stephen G. Breyer, could hear it too. Only 2 hours before, they and the other 7 justices of the Supreme Court had issued their final decision of the 2021-22 term. Justice Breyer, a pragmatic consensus builder, was now stepping down from that august body, having been privileged to serve as one of his law clerks more than 2 decades before. I would be stepping up in his place. I drew a deep breath to steady myself as the door in front of us swung wide and a court officer stepped aside to allow our passage into the room. Suddenly blinded by bright lights, I took a moment to understand that the source was a bank of video cameras set up to record the ceremony. As my eyes adjusted and I processed into the chamber behind the 2 justices, I felt heartened by the sight of my loved ones beaming at me from rows of chairs on the right side of the room. Chief Justice Roberts began by warmly welcoming those present. Then he turned toward me, now assuming a ceremonial air. "Are you prepared to take the oath?" he asked, his tone more formal than it had been a moment before. "I am," I responded, in a voice that sounded firmer than I felt. Patrick positioned himself between Chief Justice Roberts and me and held out a stack of 2 Bibles. "Please raise your right hand," the Chief Justice said, and I did so briskly, simultaneously resting my left palm on the pair of holy books. On top was our ancient Jackson family Bible, its brittle pages protected by the black leather binding that Patrick had had the foresight to get refurbished in 2013 when I'd been appointed to the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. I had sworn every oath since then on this cherished family Bible, just as I would now swear the constitutional oath to be administered by Chief Justice Roberts, followed by the judicial oath to be given to me by Associate Justice Breyer. Nominated by President Joe Biden 4 months earlier, I, the daughter of African-American parents who had come of age in the segregated South during the 1950s and early 1960s, would become the 116th Justice and the first Black woman to sit on the Supreme Court in its 233-year history. These details made the other sacred volume on which I would swear my historic oath doubly significant. Tucked beneath our family's holy book was the Harlan Bible, donated to the court in 1906 by Associate Justice John Marshall Harlan. This tome had been used for the oath-taking by every Supreme Court appointee since then. Each new justice had also signed one of the book's flyleaves after being sworn in. When the court curator brought the Bible to me in my temporary chambers later that afternoon so that I could add my own signature to the venerated roll, I thought about the justices of Harlan's era, who collectively decided in the Plessy versus Ferguson opinion that state laws mandating the separation of people by race did not violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution so long as the separate facilities were equal. Harlan had been the sole dissenter in the notorious 1896 case. And now here I was, affixing my signature to his Bible in black fountain pen ink. Only one generation after my mother and father had experienced the spirit-crushing effects of racial segregation in housing, schooling, and transportation while growing up in Florida, their daughter was standing on the threshold of history, the embodiment of our ancestors' dreams, ascending to a position that Justice Harlan and his colleagues likely never imagined possible for someone like me. But if Justice Harlan and his contemporaries could not have pictured this moment, my family and I, and indeed most of America, were fully cognizant of the significance of my nomination and confirmation to our nation's highest court. In subsequent conversations with people from across the country, I learned that I had been carried on a million prayers lifted up on my behalf since the day of my nomination. I also fielded an avalanche of invitations to speak or appear in person as excited well-wishers wanted to know my story in whatever form or fashion I might be willing to tell it. How was it, they wondered, that someone with such an unusual name and from such an unconventional background came to stand in such an unprecedented place, swearing an oath on 2 stacked Bibles that symbolized how far our nation had traveled? Mine has been an unlikely journey in many respects. And of course, my book is about that journey. Thank you again for your interest, and I look forward to talking about it here tonight.
Evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I can feel your excitement. Can you feel mine? My heart is like, oh, I don't know, in my throat.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be sitting before a judge. I've always tried to behave myself, follow the law of the land. So if I have to, this is, of course, most magnificent.
Thank you.
So your book, lovely one. I hope you all have it in your hands, or you'll have it in your hands very soon. I literally just finished maybe about 30 minutes ago.
Really?
I got it a couple of days ago, and I just could not sit here without finishing it. And it's just so compelling and so beautiful, and it calms my spirit because I feel like I share a lot in common with you, you know?
It's amazing how many people have said that to me
that
recently.
right?
Yes.
It really
that your story
really
is so familiar.
Yeah,
in a
because
lot
we
of
think
ways.
judge and it's like, oh, so lofty, so grand, so unattainable, and yet so human. And
Thank you.
And what a journey. We all have a journey, and we all have a story to tell, and
Thank
yours
you.
is wonderful.
Thank you.
So look forward to reading it. It is in part an ode to the people who have inspired you, encouraged you, nurtured you, from your mother, your father, your dear Aunt Carolyn, your high school debate teacher,
Yes.
all the clerks, the three lawyers that you clerked under, your husband, of course, your dedicated husband, your children, not to mention those in history that we've heard of, Judge Constance Baker Motley. And others. But to write your memoir is a daunting test.
Yes.
It is a daunting feat, especially in light of your day job. What led you to write this book at this moment, at this time in your life?
Well, thank you again, all of you, for being here, and thank you for letting me have the chance to talk about the book, which I actually started writing a little over 2 years ago, right after the confirmation hearing. And some of you may have seen that process. You know, I was just so grateful to have survived it, gotten through it successfully, and and I started thinking about all of the people and the circumstances that I really felt were most responsible for this accomplishment. I say in the book, in the preface, you know, that no one reaches the highest of heights on their own, and I really believe that. And so before I embarked on this new chapter of my life, I really felt as though it was important to stop and reflect and pay tribute to the people who helped me to be in this position.
I can imagine just reading your book and getting to the section where they're looking to confirm, you know, that they're seriously looking at you, and you're one of the ones that they're nominating, looking, and all of the history of your life that they have to go through, all the people that, you know, who do you know, who are your 10 best friends, who do you hang out with, this, that, and the other thing, you know, all the decisions that you've made, you know, all the rulings, all the papers, everything. I suppose this might have been easier.
Well, I did have
in relation to that.
I did have to.
A lot had been done.
Exactly. I had to do a lot of reflecting as part of the confirmation hearing, because they really do want to look through your whole history and make sure that you aren't going to have any skeletons in your closet that they'll find during the process. But, you know, I think this was more a real labor of love, because I just, again, was so grateful for all of the people who poured into me, like my parents. You mentioned my parents, and I talked a little bit about them in the part of the preface that I read from. But I think it's important to understand their pivotal role in my upbringing and being who I am today. My parents grew up in Florida at a time of racial segregation, which, for those of you who may not know, was a period in which by law, African Americans were not permitted to participate fully in goods and services and public circumstances like everyone else. And having been so limited in their own backgrounds, when I was born in 1970, which was about 5 or 6 years after the end of segregation, after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, my parents were like, oh, well, here's our shot. Here's our shot to do all the things. And so when I was really little, my mother had me in swimming lessons and piano lessons and, memorizing poems for the Dade County Youth Fair and standing on the stage and delivering them, because they really invested in me and my education and told me from that little that I could do anything I wanted to do, and they meant it.
What was the turning point in your career when you began to believe that being on the Supreme Court was possibly attainable to you, for you?
Well, I had actually wanted to study law from very young.
4 years old.
From 4 years old. And the reason was because my father, who had been a public school teacher, like my mother, when I was born, he was a history teacher in high school, and we lived in Washington, D.C., and he started taking his classes to the Hill and to the court and sort of learning about the law in that sense, and he decided to go back to law school when I was 3 years old. And he applied to various law schools, but got into the University of Miami, which is where my parents were from. And so we moved back to Miami, and we lived on campus. At that time, they had apartments for married students, separate from the regular apartments, called married students housing, and we lived on campus. And so some of my earliest memories are of sitting at the kitchen table in that apartment with my dad sitting across from me. He's got his law books all stacked up, and I have my coloring books all stacked up. And we were working together. And I never thought you could do anything but be a lawyer, because that was obviously what one was supposed to do.
Clerked under him.
I did.
Actually,
right.
was your first clerk.
So I had been interested in law. And then in middle school, I learned about Judge Motley. You mentioned Constance Baker Motley. She was the first African-American female judge on the federal bench. And she was fabulous. And the thing that so stuck out to me is that we share a birthday.
Happy belated birthday,
Thank
September 14th.
September 14th.
4 days ago, yes.
And I just remember finding that out in middle school, and then this idea of first wanting to be a lawyer, and now I could be a judge. So I'd always had that in my mind, but I think it really wasn't until I clerked for judges, so you get a sense of what judges actually do, and then when I became a judge, I thought it's a possibility that I could be elevated to
So that
something
was
like
years after one of your roommates or sister friends from Harvard
Yes.
stood in your dorm room and declared that
Oh, yes.
you were the one who
Yes.
were going to become a Supreme Court justice.
Yes.
So others have seen it in you, prayed it for you, hoped it for you before
Yes.
you even began
That's true.
to hope in your
That
own
is
heart.
true. People along the way would
Yeah.
tell me, oh, you're interested in law, you want to be a judge, you're going to be on the Supreme Court. So,
Okay. So give it to our friends who impress,
yes, exactly.
moments into our lives. You also write about the time in which you were coming of age. Introduce us to young Ketanji. Tell us about her, a little about her. Is there anything that we might be surprised to hear?
Well, I think the story about wanting to be a lawyer very young is surprising. I think I was always interested in theater and performance from very young.
You have that in common.
Which we have in common. If I wasn't going to be a lawyer, I might have been an actress. I think I was a pretty typical child, with the exception of having extraordinary parents and having extraordinary people who really invested in me. I talk in the book about my debate coach. Some of you may have done speech and debate or be familiar with speech and debate. I did speech, which was the writing of my own speeches. It's an event called Original Oratory. And I wrote speeches and delivered them, memorized them and delivered them. And my coach just taught me how to reason and how to write. And she would take me to these tournaments, and going to Harvard, for example, was the first time I knew anything about Harvard. Went to this big public high school in Florida. I didn't know anything about Harvard. And we went on a debate tournament there. And that's how I first knew anything about applying there or going there or anything. Yeah.
Now, I was never on the speech and debate team, but there's speech or debate.
Yes.
And you were on the speech.
I was doing, there are lots of different events in a speech and debate tournament. You can do various things. I talk about this in the book. I describe some of them, but original oratory is on the speech part. And I did oratory, and I also did something called dramatic and humorous interpretation, which is sort of like, you've seen the Anna Devere Smith, the one-woman shows?
Yes.
It's like that.
Yes.
And you take a play and you cut it down, and then you do all the characters.
Right.
Affecting
different voices.
Yeah,
and
if you get the audiobook, I do a little piece of one of my
Very
pieces.
good.
From high school, dramatic interpretation.
You could do voiceovers very well. You
thank
could do
you.
animation, characters. You got them in your back pocket.
So that was part of my love of theater, I think. But I loved performance. I loved, I loved writing too.
Yes.
Which is another skill that goes into legal practice. But my debate coach and my time in debate, I think, was a very pivotal moment for me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember one of the stories you tell in the book about when you in Atlanta.
Yes.
And that you had pieced together
Yes.
stories. It was about the Atlanta child murders.
Yes.
And Nikki Giovanni had written a piece, and also
Intozaki
Intozaki
Shange.
Shange.
Yes.
How you
I wove them
wrote
together.
a piece
Yes.
together, and how
Yes.
affecting it was
It
at
was
that time.
really, really extraordinary, and I did it in Atlanta, and it was very powerful.
That audiences were crying, and
Yes.
so even on display then, your heart
Yeah.
for the people, for the children, for justice.
Yes.
But it was the only time you could do that because it was emotionally.
It was very
draining
emotional.
for
It was very
15-year-old,
Yes.
14-year-old at the time.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
You met Dr. Patrick Graves Jackson while at Harvard.
I did.
Your husband, your
I
wonderful
did.
husband. What has it meant to you to have such his support by your side all these years? I mean, from the sophomore year at
Yes.
Harvard, when he would put his his room key on your earring
Yes.
and just pester you a bit.
So I think it's important to sort of tell the story about how we met. So I'm this, from big public high school in Florida, don't know much about Harvard other than gone there for the debate tournament. Patrick, on the other hand, is, I don't know, some of you may have heard this term, Boston Brahmin. Patrick has relatives who came over on the Mayflower. He is 7th generation Harvard. So his family's from Boston. It's like a whole thing. And so we take a class. He's a year ahead of me in college. And he's a junior, I'm a sophomore. And we take a class called The Changing Concept of Race in America. And we're in this class, and it's like one of those stadium seating kind of deals. And he's sitting on the row behind me, and he's tapping on my shoulder, and he's whispering things, and flicking my ears and whatever. And he's kind of annoying, but he's a little cute, so I let it go. I let it go. And then we start to get to be friends. Maybe 2 weeks or so, we talk to each other. This class is Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then I notice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he's in my government class, and I look down and I wave, and he doesn't pay any attention to me. He's not talking to me, he's not saying anything. And I'm thinking, this is so bizarre. So I say to my roommates, you know, what's up with this guy? And they're like, leave him alone, he's crazy. You don't
Sometimey.
Yes, they're like, he's gaslighting you, don't, you know. And I say, no, I'm gonna confront him on one of the friendly days. So on one of the days that I expect him to talk to me, I say to him, hey, why don't you talk to me in our government class? And he says, I'm not taking a government class. And I said, yes, you are, I see you. And he's like, oh, you must be talking about my identical twin brother.
That's a line.
He has an identical twin brother. Oh, really? And so when we got past that hurdle, we actually were just friends for basically the whole academic year. We ended up taking another class together. We were study partners. But I kind of liked him. I started liking him. But, you know, I was nervous. I'd never had a serious boyfriend. I'd never had any boyfriend, really. And I just didn't know whether he liked me or how it was going to go. Until the last day of that year, my sophomore year, his junior year. The day before, he says, listen, you know, I've been telling you about my family and my family's house. They have a vacation house on the Cape. He says, do you want to go and see our house, you know, now that finals are over, before you go home to Florida? And I say, okay, well, that sounds nice, you know. So he picks me up, we're driving out there, and I keep looking at him, thinking, are we on a date? I don't know if we're on a date. Like, I didn't know.
No frame of reference.
No frame of reference. I wanted it to be a date, but I wasn't sure. And then the whole day goes by, and we're like looking at the house, and we're, you know, hanging out, and nothing happens. Nothing happens. He doesn't try to hold my hand. He doesn't try to do, and I'm like, by the end of it, I'm furious, okay?
I don't know. I can't imagine what these conversations.
This has been the biggest waste of time. He obviously doesn't like me. This is terrible.
Did you have in your poker face? I mean, you're an actress.
You know, I'm an actress.
Yeah.
I tried to play it off.
You didn't see your annoyance.
Well, then he says, so my parents' house is in Boston, about 30 minutes away, on the way back to campus. Why don't we stop by there? I'll make you dinner, and then I'll take you back to the dorm. So I'm like, fine, whatever. Because I'm mad now. So we go, he makes dinner, I meet his parents, they're lovely. Then he says, well, I rented this movie, and, you know, why don't we watch the movie, and then I'll take you home. So again, I'm like, I don't have any choice, what am I gonna do? So we're sitting on the couch in the den, and he does one of these numbers.
That whole number.
And you know what I say?
What'd you say?
No! Because by this time, I was convinced he didn't like me, and this was just like, so I jumped up and I said, no, I don't want to be hurt. And he stood up, and he took my hands, and he said, Ketanji, I will never hurt you, I love you. And that was when I knew.
You like that as your first date.
That was our first date. And we then dated for 7 years, and we've been married for 28 years now.
First love, only love. But what was the additional thing he said? Why didn't he say anything when you're on this deserted island? That was the part I really liked about him. Why he didn't make a move on the deserted island.
Because he said, you know, we were far away from campus or anyone you knew, and I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. If, you know, there was no way that, if you didn't like me, he said, you know, there's nothing you could do. And so I just didn't want to put you in that position.
Right, you'd be beholden to get
exactly,
back to
to get back to.
I like this guy. You write about your village
Yes.
when it comes to being a mother and a wife. In what ways might your balancing act as a working parent be familiar to other working parents? In what ways do you think your experience might be singular?
Oh. Well, I do think it's very familiar to working parents to have to juggle the responsibilities. I know, for example, many parents struggle, as we did, with who is going to pick up the kids at the end of the day. School's out, and somebody's got to be there to either be at the bus stop or what I call it is the parent pickup hat. Who's donning the parent pickup hat today? I talk a little bit in the book about being a young mother and going back to work and really struggling with missing my baby, struggling with having to pump breast milk and not knowing where to do that and then where to store it. It was really, really challenging, I think, to be a young mother in a big law firm, and I talk about that dynamic as well. So I think a lot of people have said they have very familiar experiences.
Absolutely.
I think it might be sort of singular, the fact that Patrick is a surgeon and trained as a surgeon throughout our time together. And I got to tell you, being a surgeon who has a patient on the operating room table pretty much trumps every other thing. So, I'm constantly saying, you're supposed to go to the daddy and me class with our daughter on Saturday. And he's like, oh yeah, I just got to go to the hospital for a few minutes before I do that. And then of course I know the nurse is going to call 10 minutes before the program is supposed to start and say, I'm sorry, Dr. Jackson's in the operating room. This happens over and over again. And then you feel guilty for being mad because he's like saving people's lives. And I'm like, what are you doing? We had a date. Why are you, I hosted parties by myself. I did all kinds of things because of his job. So that was very challenging too.
It's amazing, you two and your professions and how you made
Yes.
the sense of it that you did.
Yes.
Thank goodness. While we're talking about your family, I think it's important to share with the audience how your daughter, Layla, then 11 years old, knew long before President Biden that you should be appointed a Supreme Court judge.
She did.
Young Layla clearly knew something that you didn't know at the time.
She did.
Tell us about that beautiful moment.
So this actually happened back under President Obama in 2016, not long after Justice Scalia died. So my daughter at that point is 11. She's in middle school with her friends, and I'm a judge on a lower court. And she comes into the room, Patrick and I are there, and she says, Mom, did you hear that Justice Scalia died? And I said, yes, I know that. She says, well, my friends and I were talking, and you're a judge, and we think you should apply for that position. And I said, sweetheart, being a Supreme Court justice is not a job you can apply for. The president just has to kind of know about you among all of the lawyers and judges and people who would want that job. He knows about you, and then he appoints you. And she says, well, if he has to know about you, then I'm going to write him a letter and tell him who you are. And she goes off, and she comes back in a little while with a handwritten letter that she had written. Mm-hmm. I put it in the book because it's so amazing. But the thing that was just the most gratifying for me is that as a working mom who had devoted a lot of time to my job and feeling like, am I giving enough time to my daughters? Do they even know what's going on with me? It was just so wonderful to have this endorsement from my 11-year-old. I didn't even think she knew anything about me. And I didn't. I didn't make fresh baked cookies for the bake sale. I wasn't that kind of mom. And so for her to write a letter that had listed out my qualities, and for her to be so confident, for her to use her own voice, I thought, I must be doing something right. I must be doing something right.
It's beautiful. And then you got the letter to President
Yes,
Obama.
we did. We found a way.
Subsequently, through Biden, here we are. So thank you, Layla. During the process of your Supreme Court appointment, you and your family discussed the increased scrutiny that you would experience in this
Yes.
new position and the ways others might start to feel ownership or over familiarity with you. How did you and your family react to such a shift? Do you imagine a new kind of awareness might emerge after the publication of Lovely One?
Yes, yes. Well, how did we react? Well, first, the audience might not know, but I talk about this in the book. My older daughter is autistic. And we actually didn't discover this until she was in 7th grade. But we had struggled with really trying to help her and support her as a young child. And we knew that she had some issues, but we weren't quite sure what was happening. And so one of the things that I was concerned about as it became clear that I was on the short list and could possibly be nominated for the Supreme Court is how would this affect my family, this intense scrutiny? Would she was an adult at the time, very young adult, but would she want people to know? Could it come out and that be an issue? And if my family wasn't prepared to go through the kind of, spotlight that it takes to be on the Supreme Court, I would have declined the nomination. That is a possibility. I mean, you can say, no, thank you, Mr. President, I appreciate it. And so we convened a meeting, Patrick and I, to explain that, we'd heard from the White House that I was being vetted along with some other people, and that I might not get the nomination, but if I did, it would entail some pretty significant scrutiny, and is everybody on board with this? And my daughters were both very supportive. Talia said things like, it doesn't matter if people know, it's who I am, I have nothing to be ashamed of. And I felt so supported by that because they knew that this had been a dream of mine, but certainly one that I would have given up if it turned out that my daughters were not comfortable with it.
They're very brave and courageous young women, and I think that's a testament to the love they have from their mother and their father. They're
Thank you.
secure in where they stand and who they are.
Thank you.
And in you. So well done, Mom. I know those moments that you speak of,
Yes.
because certainly my days sometimes are 12 to 16 hours.
Yes.
So I've wondered, and sometimes I go fishing, like Bronwyn Slater, am I doing okay? And
Yes.
Yeah, Mom, I know I'm never home. I'm not home much. And they're like, and
They're fine.
they allay my little fears and concerns. But we want to be all places at all times.
Absolutely.
But we can do it all, but not at the same time. Maybe.
Correct.
You write about how you faced fear early on in your life. Please describe the moment that led you to your decision to never allow fear to shut you down.
Yes. Well, so I was about 8 or 9 years old. And as I said, my parents were public school teachers. My mother continued as a teacher and administrator in the public school systems throughout her whole career. And at this particular time, we were at a backyard pool party for one of her colleagues. And I, as I mentioned, loved to swim. I was doing all the swimming lessons and all the things. And one of the things I loved to do in the pool was to float on my back. And I was in the pool with other kids, but I decided I was gonna float kind of out in the deep end of the pool. So I go and I'm out there, and when I kind of look over, I see that I'm pretty far from the edge. And for some reason, I panicked. And I start flailing around, and I sink to the bottom of the pool. And there was loud music and people running around, and no one noticed right away. But my mother kind of looked around and screamed when she saw me, and the person who was hosting the pool party jumped in fully clothed and pulled me out. And I was relieved, obviously, but I was also just so disappointed in myself because I knew how to swim. So what was going on? And I just remember feeling like that's never going to happen again, that I am not going to panic. If I'm in the deep end of any situation, I will swim. That's... And I've sort of taken that lesson, throughout my life in all sorts of situations.
What are some of the pressures that come with being the first Black woman to ascend to such a prominent position? What are some of the unique opportunities and revelations that you've already experienced in these past 2 years?
Yes. Well, I think being the first of anybody who is breaking new ground feels some pressure of expectations and of having people wondering, curious, are you going to be able to do this? And so, that's something that I think you have to kind of deal with. But it also represents progress in a way when you're the first in moving into new territory. It means that now new doors are opening, ceilings are being shattered, and this is a good thing. So you feel as well a sense of pride in being able to be a path breaker in that way. I've said at other programs, I am so honored to serve in this position, to be the first Black woman, but I know very well that I'm not the first Black woman who could have done this job. And so what that means is that I feel so fortunate. I think about Judge Motley, for example. I mean, she argued like 10 or 11 cases in the Supreme Court and won all but one of them. I mean, she was unbelievable. But she was born at a time in which sitting on the Supreme Court would not have been possible because she was a Black woman.
Or Pauli Murray.
Or Pauli Murray, or many, many other women. So I just feel enormous gratitude. That to me is even beyond the pressure. And I also feel a responsibility to do a good job because I don't want to be the last, Black woman on the Supreme Court. My grandmother, who I talk a lot about in the book, and who was a very kind, very wonderful, very religious woman, used to quote from the Bible, and it's a quote that has stuck with me throughout my professional career. She would say, to whom much is given, much is required. And that is something that I've taken to heart in terms of the preparation and the work ethic and doing what I think is necessary for me to show up in this position and to do the work. When I went through my investiture on the Supreme Court, I gave a speech at the end of which I said, I have a seat at the table now and I'm ready to work. And that's what I do.
Exactly. And I love something your mother said, I know, when you talk about being the first or one of the first,
Yeah.
and she would admonish you and
Yes.
say, this thing has been done before.
Yes. Well,
So you can't.
she is part of the encouragement.
Right.
My mother would set very high expectations for me as a child and say, you can do them. And she would, when I would whine and cry and say, oh, I can't do it, she would say, I'm sorry, has this been done before? Have you seen somebody else do this? And I'd say, yes. She would say, well, then you can do it too. So, yes.
Well, those are my questions, but we have a few from the audience
Yes.
that we've taken beforehand.
Sure.
They have some doozies for us.
Uh-oh.
All the personal. How do you see your role as the first Black woman on the Supreme Court influencing future generations of women and people of color who aspire to serve in the judiciary?
Well, I hope it will influence them to do it, because we need people who believe in the law, who invest their time and energy in this profession. One of the things I talk about in the book pretty early on is how much the law has impacted the lived experiences of African Americans.
Yes.
This is why I talk so much in the book about cases and about the intersection of law and life. And so I hope that seeing me will be like me seeing Constance Baker Motley, and will encourage people to study the law and to maybe become lawyers and maybe judges.
I hope so, because as we know, we've heard the numbers and the courts are overwhelmed. The cases are so many, so
Yes.
we do need more. So thank you for your representation. How has your background in public defense shaped your approach to interpreting the Constitution and deciding cases, especially regarding criminal justice and civil rights?
So, I think the best example of how being a public defender has mattered really came up in the context of my work as a trial judge. So I was a judge in the federal system at all 3 levels. I was also a law clerk at all 3 levels. So I have quite a bit of experience in handling cases in the criminal justice system. But as a federal public defender, one of the things that I noticed was how few of my clients really understood the process, understood what was happening to them. I was an appellate defender, which meant that all of my clients had been convicted, and the start of my representation was usually me calling them in jail and saying, I've been appointed to help you to prepare an appeal. So the first thing is tell me about your case so that we can sort of think about where there might have been mistakes that we can raise on appeal. And I was surprised at how many of my clients really just couldn't help me with that assignment because they didn't know what had happened in their cases. And so taking that knowledge, when I became a trial judge and my responsibility was to handle criminal cases, to sentence people, to do all sorts of things, I was very intentional about communicating to defendants and explaining to them what's going on. I had a script where I wrote out every stage, Mr. So-and-so, this is what's going to happen now. And when I would sentence people, I would, take a long time describing what the process was, what the crime was, why it was so damaging, that this person that you needed to go to jail for this amount of time, et cetera, because I wanted people to not be confused. I thought it was very important for the administration of justice, because at the end of the day, what you want is for people to go to jail if they have to go to jail, and reform, come out and not commit crimes anymore. And what was happening was that for people like my clients, when they went in and they didn't understand and nobody explained, they would actually spend more time being upset about the system mistreating them than reflecting on what they had done and changing their behavior. So it seemed to me that it was more important for justice, ultimately, to make sure that people were respected in the context of the process. And I think I was doing that in part because I had been a defender and I had understood what it meant to my clients to be, not have that kind of respect going through the system. So that is one example. I don't know that I'm trying to think of ways in which it matters more right now in terms of the way in which I look at criminal cases. I'm sure that my experience does impact, just like everyone's experience impacts. One of my favorite quotes is from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that the life of the law is not logic, it is experience. And I think that's right. I think every judge comes to cases with their own perspective or perceptions based on their experience as you try to determine who has the better of the argument. So I think there's no doubt that my criminal defense background has some role to play in how I view the issues and think about the case.
I really also appreciate in the book when you, the experience that you had and the passion that you have for the law for defendants in terms of plea bargaining and
Yes.
those sort of things
Yes.
that are their inequity.
Yes, I had a very, very, very significant experience before I became a lawyer. A couple of things happened before I became a lawyer. One was that my father's older brother was arrested and convicted of a nonviolent drug courier offense and got a life sentence. And I didn't know. I knew obviously that he had been arrested and went away, but I didn't know for how long. And I found this out when he called me when I was a public defender. And so I talk about that experience in the book, but not a lot of people who are judges have family members who are themselves in the system in this way. And so I think that has an impact. But I also did an internship before I went to law school at a place called the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, which was in Harlem, doing defense work. And it was such an eye-opening experience for me about things like plea bargains and excessive bail and the way in which our legal processes impact the lives of real people in all kinds of ways, poor people especially. And so, yes, all of those experiences, I think, really help me in my day job.
Your appointment has been seen as a historic moment for racial and gender equality. How do you balance your public responsibility with the culture, with the need to remain impartial and neutral as a judge?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my entire duty is to remain neutral and impartial as a judge. That's what judges do. So,
Good law.
yeah, it's not really a balance. It is me being a woman of color doing the work, and the work is being an impartial, neutral arbiter of the legal issue in the cases that come before me. And I just hope that by doing the job to the best of my ability, people see that anyone can do this job. Everyone should have the opportunity who wants to become a lawyer, become a judge, to do it. There should be no barriers based on people's race or gender, because everyone can take the oath and agree to rule without fear or favor, which is what I do.
Amen. Let's see, I've never used this word. Collegiality?
Collegiality.
Collegiality among members is important on any court. Do you find the justices at the Supreme Court to be collegial?
Well, they actually
Do you?
They actually are. I mean,
are, yeah.
well, we are 9 people who have lifetime appointments, so you actually have to get along to some degree. I mean, you know, and the justices are all very polite, very collegial. We do things like have an opportunity to have lunch with the other justices every day that we are sitting as a court. There's lunch. Every conference day, there's lunch, and so there's a lot of lunches. And the rule at lunch is that you can't talk about cases.
Politics?
No, you can't talk about cases, and probably you shouldn't talk about politics, but you know, we talk about people's families and books and movies, and you learn about your colleagues as people, which is a helpful thing. Collegiality is very important for all sorts of reasons. And yes, and the other thing that happens is that when a new justice is appointed, the previous junior justice is responsible for essentially throwing a party to welcome the new justice. And so Justice Barrett threw this party for me, and as part of the tradition, you try to figure out something personal to the new justice who's coming in and kind of make that the theme of the party. And so she figured out that I love musicals, I love Hamilton, and she hired a Broadway actress to come and sing the songs from some of the songs from Hamilton. She made a big poster that had the room where it happens on it. It was great. It was great. So we try to do things to support the collegial spirit and nature of the court.
I know one of your other favorite songs from Hamilton is "History Has Its Eyes on You."
Yes, ma'am.
And indeed, history does, and so do we.
Thank you.
We are so honored by your presence.
Thank you.
We're so inspired by your life, well lived. We're so enthralled by your intellect, your beauty, your stamina.
Thank you.
And as your sophomore year, when you encountered perhaps an angel unaware,
Yes.
I think we'll leave you with persevere.
Thank you.
Persevere.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.